Welcome to Small Talk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of Small Talk, I'm going to be joined by Leah Cypess, who also writes under the pen name Leah Sokol, so we'll get to that in a minute. But she is the author of a number of books, some in the Jewish fiction, Jewish history, including a book on Nathan Sharansky and Yosef Mendelovich, and a bunch of a book about Purim and some other books as well. That's all written under Leah Sokol, as well as a number of books published with mainstream publishers under Leah Cypess, which are fiction, fantasy, science fiction, and so on. So really, for two different markets, we'll talk some fiction here on Small Talk. And thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with, what is that like that you write? You have this dual career. You're writing this fiction for a general audience, a totally non-Jewish audience, published by major publishers, and then you're also writing books published by the regular Judaica Press, Menucha, Mosaica Press, Jewish books for a Jewish audience.
So the mainstream books came first. I've wanted to be an author ever since I was a kid, and I've always loved science fiction and fantasy. So when I was in high school, I sold my first story to a fantasy magazine, and then I started trying to write books. I wrote 4 books that I sent to all the publishers, and they all rejected. And my 5th book ended up getting published, and that was my first young adult fantasy novel. And since then, I've published 4 young adult fantasy novels, 6 tween novels, 1 recent book for 8 to 12-year-olds that's called Future Me Saves the World and Ruins My Life, and an early chapter book series that's called Miriam's Magical Creature Files. And all those books are published, like you said, by mainstream publishers like Random House, HarperCollins, Simon & Schuster. Then at a certain point in my writing career, I wrote a Purim book, which was the story of Megillas Esther retold from the point of view of Achashverosh's horse. And once I wrote that book, I realized that it would have to be a Judaica book because it doesn't really make sense and the humor isn't really funny unless you know the story of Megillas Esther. So I reached out to my agent and I told her that I wanted to do some Judaica books. Well, I shouldn't say I reached out to my agent first. First, I tried to get the book published. When I finally had a publisher interested in publishing it, then I reached out to my agent and I said, I want to do these Judaica books. It's a totally separate market. You're not interested in getting involved with this because there's also not a lot of money in it. And I just want to handle these on my own. And we came to an agreement where she said, okay, do those on your own, use a pen name, make sure you don't sign any contract that gets you in trouble if I try to sell books for you, and that will be your thing. So I've been doing that at the same time. And Baruch Hashem, I've now published 7 books under this pen name of Leah Sokol.
So just, it's interesting, you say there you published a book for a major publisher in fantasy and science fiction, and then you went into the Jewish market. But it's also that it's totally different. Yes, you did something interesting similar where you published, The King's Horse, you're retelling the Purim story. But your other books are really kind of history, more history for kids kind of books. You didn't go into the science fiction fantasy in the Jewish books, really. So it's very different also. Not only different audiences, is it fair to say your books are kind of different?
Yeah, so I think they are different. I really love Jewish history, so once I'm publishing Judaica books, that's really what interests me. I would say my 2 loves when I'm reading are fantasy and science fiction and history. So when I'm writing my books for the mainstream audience, so far they're all just straight fiction, science fiction, and fantasy. And like you said, most of my books for the Judaica audiences are history. Either they're historical fiction or they're straight history biographies, like my biographies of Yosef Mendelovich and Natan Sharansky.
Right. You have a book also, No Day Without Torah, so about story of Rameir Shapiro and Daf Yomi. Then you have a kind of historical fiction, the Spanish plot. You're a child in 15th century Spain. Can you stop the Barbanel's grandson from being kidnapped, which was a historical story that took place? You did that. You have a British escape, a kid in World War II London. So, I mean, these are all kind of, and you have some other, but these are all really kind of history kind of books for kids, if you will, as opposed to when you go to the Leah Cypess books. Your mainstream books are totally fiction, retellings of a lot of the fairy tales, if you will, some of them, and some of them are, like you said, tween books. They're just really straight fiction, so totally different, which is interesting. And another thing that you mentioned, it's worth doing also, is that you said, there's no money. I don't know what you're talking about this, but, the differences between, is it just scope? That when one goes to the non-Jewish world, you're publishing with Random House, and then Penguin's publishing however many books that is, as opposed to the Jewish market is so small, or are there other factors there?
I think
author in both worlds.
Right. So I think it's part of it is market. That's probably the biggest part of it is market. The Jewish market is very small. A book that sells, I don't actually know what the numbers of the books are, but I imagine that a book that sells enough to be a major bestseller in the Jewish world, those same numbers would make it a flop in the mainstream world, right? Because you have different numbers that you can reach. And I think another part of it is partly as a result of that, the big publishers always have some big hits on their hands. So let's say if you're the publisher that published Harry Potter or Twilight, you can afford to pay more money on other books and see which one of them becomes the next Harry Potter, the next Twilight, the next bestseller, whatever. They can afford to spend more money on a specific book because they're publishing more books. So even if they lose money on one book, they made it up by another book that was a success.
But what's interesting is even in your books for the mainstream market, like you have Glass Slippers, like you're retelling the Cinderella story, and then it's like Cinderella's third wicked stepsister, Tirza. Like you're taking a Jewish name, or you said the series that you're working on now, Miriam's Magical Creature Files, you say clearly that it's an Orthodox Jewish girl, right? Even to the mainstream world, your characters are Jewish or Jewish-ish, right?
Right. So for the fairy tale retelling, she's really not Jewish. In my mind, it's Tirza. Although I realize that a lot of people who know who I am are like, oh, you stuck a Jewish name in there. And I was like, no, that wasn't my intention. Maybe it was subconscious. In the case of Miriam's Magical Creature Files, that was intentional. I originally wrote that book thinking that it would be a book for a Judaica audience. So when I wrote The Truth About the Tooth Fairy, which was the first Miriam's Magical Creature Files book, and the main character is from, and all her friends are from, and her family is from, I thought I was writing that book for a from audience. And then after I finished the book, and once I had started reading a lot of other chapter books in order to see what works for early chapter books, I saw that there were really a lot of early chapter books out there that were about different cultures. They weren't all, standard American families. So I ended up emailing the book to my agent. I said, hey, I never told you I was writing this book because I thought I was writing it for a Judaica audience. But what do you think? Do you think you could sell it to a mainstream publisher? And she said, yes, I think I can. And she did. So that's how that ended up being a Leah Cypess book that is, that's in regular public libraries and bookstores.
So although these are the Leah Cypess books are mainstream books, do you yourself try to publicize and push those books to from people, like from people to read them?
I have my community and my family, and I'm on some Facebook books from people who are like looking for kosher books for their kids. And I will say, these are my books. I wrote them from audience. But as you know, there's a wide variety when it comes to what from parents will let their kids read. So I'm not going to say I am a from person, therefore everyone in Lakewood would let their kids read my books. Definitely not. So I always say, if you let your kids read Harry Potter, you're definitely fine with letting them read my books. If you won't, they probably can't read my books just because because the books themselves are not from books. They're regular mainstream books.
Now, all your books are either for kids or they're like tweens. You haven't, I don't think you've really written adult fiction or adult history. Is that in the plans, or is there a reason you deliberately stay away from that?
So I've written adult fiction in short stories. So I've published at this point a lot of science fiction and fantasy stories in science fiction and fantasy magazines that nobody will ever have heard of unless they're into that. But I've been pretty successful with that. I've been nominated for awards and other things. And I do have in mind that I would like to write adult fiction at some point. But the thing about adult fiction is that, one, it has to be much longer. And two, believe it or not, it usually pays less than writing children's books. So when I have an idea that needs to be an adult book, I will write it. And I do want to write an adult book because I just like to cover all the genres and I'd like to do different things. But so far, nothing that I've published in book length form has been for adults.
Right. It's interesting. You said no one will have heard of it. Some science fiction or fantasy analogies have come up on the podcast, and I think I've gotten some feedback. I think somehow, like you said, there's an interest in history and fantasy and science fiction. I mean, I know myself, but there's like an
intersection
there where people are interested in both. And I know you listen to the podcast. Like, there's some people interested in both somehow.
Yeah.
That, it comes about. So, how do you pick? Let's go to the Leah Sokol books, and like I said, you published a number of the Jewish history books. How do you pick the topic? Especially, you did a number of the Russian Jews. How do you pick? Like, there's specifically a reason why you picked that, or how did you come to those books?
Well, when I'm writing history, I'm not trained as a historian. So what I like is when there's a book when the information is already out there for adults, and I can take that information from those secondary sources and make it accessible for children, because that's what I can do. I can't really do my own original historical research. So Yosef Mendelevich, for example, has written his own memoir. And I took that memoir, and actually everyone who was involved in the Leningrad hijacking, which is the center of what the book is about, a lot of them have written their own memoirs. So I had a lot of information that I could easily read and access, and then I could write a book that was accessible for children. Or Natan Sharansky, for example, has written a lot of books. And in his case specifically, once you've read what he wrote, it seems like the book almost writes itself. Just because in a book for children, you like to have a lot of humor, and he's very funny. So I almost just felt like I was just picking out all his jokes and putting them together in a book. And that was my book. And I'm always reading. So I read a lot of history. I read a lot of biographies. And whenever I read something, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, ooh, would this make a good story for children? And not all stories, obviously, not all biographies can easily be made into biographies that are accessible for children. But when I read one that can, then I go for it.
So like the story about the Barbanel, you were reading like Netanyahu, some other classic biography of Barbanel, and you decided, I'm going to write this story?
Right. So exactly. So I read Netanyahu's biography of the Barbanel, and I was trying to think about how I could make it into a children's biography. And that was one of those stories where it wouldn't really make a great children's book, a straight biography of the Barbanel. But I was thinking, oh, how can I tell his story somehow? And then I got the idea of this choose your own adventure style book about one particular episode in his life. And then I had my way in to write about the Barbanel.
And Rameir Shapiro Daf Yomi, is that like they're like a personal connection, or you just decided that that's something, again, you want to tell kids about?
So that was literally a question in my mind. I said, I wonder who started Daf Yomi. I had no idea. And
really?
I started looking into it. Really, I had no idea. And I started looking into it. And I found the biography of him that was originally written in Yiddish and that was translated. And then there's sort of a coffee table book about Daf Yomi. And those were my two main sources. And then I had the information, and I, took out certain parts of it. I had to leave a lot out. That was very interesting about his life, to just keep it focused on Daf Yomi. But that's why I wrote that book.
Right, because it's not a straight biography of him. It's focused on Daf Yomi specifically. Right. So when you're working on projects, you have a wide variety of stuff here in your books, and we didn't even get the Leah Cypess. Like I said, you have we already said the various magical creatures. You have like the retelling of the classical fairy tales. You have tween books. Like, what are you working on at once? Do you have multiple different projects and genres that you're working on at the same time? How does that work?
So basically, yes. I am a multitasker by nature. I really find it hard to focus on one thing for more than a few hours at a time. It's like, when I was working as a lawyer, you have these like little time clocks where you press which client you're working on. So I never had a time clock going for more than half an hour. Like I would just jump from one to the other. Because whenever I'm working on something, and especially writing, which has to be creative, which takes a lot of energy. So often I'll wake up in the morning, I'll start working on something. Let's say I'll write for an hour, and then I get to a point where I really don't know what happens next. And I could push myself through it and force something out, and then maybe it would work. Maybe I'd have to erase it, or I can just move on to another project. So that's what I do. I jump around a lot.
Is the creative process different when you're writing for a Jewish audience versus a mainstream audience?
So for those audiences, the creative process is not different. The process is very different if I'm writing fiction versus when I'm writing nonfiction. Because when I'm writing fiction, it all has to come from me. When I'm writing nonfiction, it comes from the sources. So I never really get stuck because I'll just go back to reading the research.
Right. And none of you didn't write historical fiction, right?
Well, so the British Escape and the Spanish Plot are really, they're choose your own adventure style books. You're not allowed to say choose your own adventure books because that's a trademark term, but they're similar to those. And those, I think of those as historical fiction.
Interesting. So there you kind of are using the sources, but you can play around with it a little bit. I guess you don't want to go too far afield and like just totally mess up the history.
Right. If I do, then that's what the afterword is for. I just say this part didn't really happen.
Right. That makes sense. But like you said, in Miriam's Magical Creatures, you originally wrote it intending a Jewish audience, and then you published it for a mainstream audience. So the creative process, the writing process there, you're seeing exactly the same. You weren't trying to do anything different because of the audience.
Right. Especially in the first draft. For the first draft, I try not to think about the audience too much. I try to think about the story. Once I'm revising and I'm in the second draft, then I do think about the audience. So once I sent it to my agent, before I sent it to my agent and said, can you publish this mainstream? Obviously, I went through it and made sure I had actually explained everything and not just assumed that my audience would know what all the words mean or what Havdalah is or what Shabbos is or anything like that. I had to find a way to explain it, but to explain it while also being amusing and entertaining and not just giving an explanation. So at that point, I was thinking about the audience.
Now, what about vice versa, though? Like when you go take a mainstream book and you do it for a Jewish book, I don't know, when you're writing for a Jewish audience, essentially, like, do you change the vocabulary, or like is any differences in the vocabulary, or no, they're exactly the same?
So the vocabulary, when I'm thinking about it, mostly depends on what age I'm writing for. And that, again, I usually address in the second draft. Also, I have children, so very often I'll just read my books to them. And if they tell me they don't understand something, then that's my key that I have to change it. When it comes to Judaica books, so I found that a lot of the former Judaica publishers have very strict ideas about what they think their audience can handle. And one thing they don't like is anything that they feel is crass in any way. So, for example, in my book about Yosef Mendelevich, when he was in prison, the way the prisoners spoke to each other was through the plumbing. So they would take a rag and soak the rag with water from the toilet and drip it out, and they would do this over and over again until the toilet was empty. And then they would stick their heads into the toilet and talk to each other through the plumbing, which I think is just, amazing. So I had a whole paragraph explaining exactly what they did, and the publisher just felt that was too much bathroom stuff, I guess. And they really shortened my description.
But they don't try to dumb down your language and say, "Oh, that's too complicated. We need like simple, boring, well, not boring, but like simple
I've
language."
never had that happen. On my own, obviously, I realized that you're not going to throw too many complicated words into a book for children. But I don't know that I've ever had pushback from a publisher after I did my own editing that said this word is too hard. And if they did, it's probably because the word really was too hard.
So if anyone goes to your websites, and I'll link them in the show notes. One is Leah Sokol, one is Leah Cypess, so you can check out both websites. It really says who each book or each series is meant for, right? It lays out clearly the ages, but like you said, most of the books are really for younger children, or like, is it 6 to 8 or somewhere over there, maybe a little older than the fairy tale books, a little old. Like it says exactly who each book or series is meant for?
Yes. Because that's how the publishers work. So for the mainstream publishers, if you walk into a Barnes & Noble, you'll see there are children's books, there are teen books, there are adult books, there are, early chapter books. You can't write a book and say it's for everyone. It has to be for a specific age, so the bookstore knows where to put it on the shelf. And the Judaica publishers tend to sell a lot for schools, so they really want to know which grade is this book for.
Right. So that, again, I'll link to the website if anyone interested can check it out. I'll also link to Amazon for those interested in purchasing your book. So just finally, a couple of questions here at the end is, what would you tell someone if there's someone that's listening or someone's interested? Well, listen, you have this from woman. She wrote these books and she's selling her books to Penguin, Random House, Simon & Schuster. Like, you're publishing mainstream publishers and Jewish publishers. For each one, what can you say? If someone wants to get published, a from author wants to go and publish with a mainstream publisher, what's that process like and how doable is it?
All right. Well, first of all, I'll say for anyone listening who's an aspiring author, if you go to either of my websites, they have an email address. And if you email me and ask questions, I'm always happy to help out young Jewish writers and, tell them all the things about the industry that they might not know. When it comes to mainstream publishers, it's different from when I started. When I started, I actually sent my first books directly to publishers. You really can't do that anymore. You have to go through a literary agent. There's a link on my Leah Cypess website. There's a page called Advice for Authors, and there's a link to the page of an author called Cynthia Liu, who has a very clear and outlined detailed summary of how to get published in the mainstream world, which is still pretty accurate. So anyone who doesn't know anything about how to even get started, I would suggest reading that to begin with, because it really lays it out. The Judaica world, like I said, there are no agents, and almost all of these publishers have websites with email addresses, and they just say directly what they're looking for and how to submit books to them.
Right. And some Judaica publishers charge you to publish their books, and some don't. Like, but for kids' books, like what you're publishing, not really. They do generally, they're willing to take on the books.
Right. So I know. So when I started out, I had no idea which publisher did what. So there are some publishers where you pay them to publish your book. And then, to be fair, then you get much higher royalties. You can sell your books yourself. There are some Judaica publishers that work a little like traditional publishers in the sense that you send them the book, they pay to publish it, and they either pay you like a small amount up front or they pay you royalties for every book that is sold. And then there are some publishers where it's sort of a mix. So especially with children's books, which usually need illustrations, there are some publishers that only accept illustrated manuscripts, which really means you have to pay an illustrator. And sometimes you have to pay for certain other things. But aside from that, the publisher will take on the costs. So there's really a mix of different ways that they will work this. And I also think it's different for different books, because I think a lot of the publishers, the Jewish publishers that will pay you for children's books, will not pay you for adult books.
Yeah, it's definitely a very interesting and very complicated world. One day, perhaps I'll do a fuller episode. It's good we got some information here for anyone interested. So, well, and anyone should reach out to you. You're a great resource because you know both worlds, so to speak. So, what are you working on now?
So the Miriam's Magical Creature Files is a series. The second book is coming out in August. The third book is coming out in April. So that is, I would say it's the main thing I'm working on now, but I already told you that I work on 5 different things at the same time. So I can't get away with that. So I am also working on 2 Jewish children's biographies about very fascinating people that I'm very excited about. I don't like talking about in advance because I used to get up all the time and talk about the books I was working on. And then those books were rejected by all the publishers. And then when people met me and they'd say, what happened to that book? I would have to say, well, it's still on my computer because nobody agreed to publish it. But I am working on 2 Jewish biographies and hopefully on another You Choose book.
Sounds good. So thank you, Leah, for joining me. And again, I'll link in the show notes to both your websites as well as Amazon for anyone who's interested in purchasing your books. Again, there's many books. We're not going to list them. There's do you know how many books in total, by the way, haven't published?
Oh, someone asked me this question recently. So it's 7 Judaica books and it is 12 mainstream books.
19. So the new Miriam book will be number 20.
Yep.
Okay. So I'll link to...
I should throw a party.
yeah, you should. So I'll link to some of them. I'll link to your websites. And like I said, for anyone interested, just check it out. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.